Hi, everyone. Welcome to this Arab Reform Initiative podcast. Well, not podcast, webinar. um, I am Malek Lakhal, Research Fellow at the Arab Reform Initiative based in Tunis. And for this webinar, which is entitled Revigorating the Concept of Democracy, we have with us three great people that I'm really glad accepted to join us for this webinar. So I'll start introducing them first and then maybe like talk a little bit about why we're having this webinar. So first, I'm gonna go for like how I see people order. So first, Layla Dakhli, who is a researcher based in Berlin, a historian based in Berlin at the Centre Marc Bloch, if I'm not mistaken, affiliated with the CNRS. She has worked on a big European research project called DREAM, which we will be talking about a bit in this webinar, which has dealt with the archives of social movements in the Arab region for, I think, the last 50 years or something. And then, I hope I'm not mistaken, next to her we have Ala Badr, who is a very dear friend of mine. She has a PhD from the European Institute in Florence, and she's currently a lecturer at Sciences Po Paris. Her work has focused mostly on Arab intellectual history and contemporary Arab intellectual movements. And I'm really happy she can join us today because we haven't been in touch for many, many years. And last but not least, Elia Ayoub, who I know as a podcaster. So Elia is a member of the collective From the Periphery. He also has a blog called Hauntologies. And From the Periphery is a very interesting group of people who do podcasts from different areas on political issues. And Elia hosts, I mean, now you co-host it, but a very interesting podcast he started on COVID called The Fire These Times, which I advise everyone to listen to. It's a really great podcast, which had taught me a lot. So yeah, I think this is it for presentations. Now I'll give a quick introduction to the panel. So why are we having this conversation? So at RE, we have, well, for decades now, followed democratic transitions in our region. Well, we have waited for them for a few years, and when they have arrived, we were there. We kind of tried to follow what's up. And we have also observed what we clumsily call detransition or counter-revolution, depends on how you call it. And the thing is, in this observation, we have noticed the fact that the democratic form, like the word democracy itself, but like the idea of a democratic transition in itself has kind of become maybe a bit tired or not the right answer to the demands of the Arab Spring. And this has raised some questions on our end about, okay, so if democracy is not enough, what is it that is actually needed or wanted? And so it has created this, questioning about these concepts and the role of intellectuals in the, I don't know, pushing further these concepts than what we usually expect of them. So the questions we've been asking, for example, have been like, what can Arab Democrats bring to the table today? Which might be a question I'll ask you later. Or where do people come in these democratic transitions? Are they just voters? Is it more than that? So yeah, I will start now. So first, I wanted to ask you, very general questions. You can answer each of you however you feel. And then I will ask each of you a question that is kind of, curated as I'm a bit familiar with each of your work. And then we will maybe have one last question and open the floor to the audience. So again, thank you for being here. And I'm going to start with Laila. So Laila, you've worked on the archives of social. Oh shit, no, that's not. That's the second question. The first question, but we can still start with Laila as she's a fellow Tunisian. So the Tunisian case, as you might know, has raised a lot of questions. Tunisia was a functional democracy more or less for 10 years, and well, it isn't anymore. And this has raised the question of, oh, so was democracy the answer from the beginning? And I think this question, I mean, this is Tunisia specific, but at the same time, this goes well beyond Tunisia. Was democracy enough of an answer, enough of a horizon for what started in 2011 and what continued throughout the decade and again in 2019 and later? So what is it enough to just, uh, call for democracy, or was it just already limiting the horizons?
Thank you. Thank you so much for this introduction, but also for this very complicated question. Was it enough? I have two answers to this question. I would say that, first of all, maybe there is a distinction to be made between what is generally called democratic transition and democracy. So then democratic transition tend to be something that has been very much forged and comes with a handbook and with a lot of steps and has been somehow applicated in Tunisia after the fall of the Ben Ali's regime, in a way that actually there was no actual time to adapt it or to answer to the demands that were coming from the revolution itself. The other way to answer, and I could go in details into that, but like maybe it sounds quite clear that like what transition to democracy means generally for like the international bodies and also for those who took charge of like, doing this process, is more or less confined to some kind of conversation about the constitution and elections, say, like standardizing models of election. Then the other way to answer would be from the perspective of the revolution itself, and then say, should we change? But like, actually, I think like people were not really asking for, at least for a democratic transition in the streets. So it's like the question, is it enough? It's not completely adequate, because this was not what people were asking for. So it's not enough because it's not actually the whole process of trying to capture was actually happening in the streets in 2010-11, but also well before that, during the post-colonial, let's say, era. To answer your question about like the amplitude, the chronological aptitude of my project, it's very much the post-colonial era that is at stake for me. I think what happened also in this moment has a lot to say about what is democracy, what it should be in terms of also posing questions to the global capitalist or neoliberal order, to the way people relate to their own identities or maybe their own belongings, and these kind of things, who were not at all at the center of the discussion after the fall of the regime. So of course it's not enough, but there is still a lot to be done from the experience of what happened in 2010-11. I don't want to talk too
Thank you.
much stuff like that.
Ala?
Yes, Malik. Well, first of all, thank you for this generous invitation, and it's really lovely to be among such good company. The question, honestly, is it requires maybe two more PhDs. I think one was enough. But to answer your question, I guess from my experience in Egypt, exactly as perhaps Leila mentioned, it was when people went on the streets, it wasn't necessarily these vocabularies that they spoke in, right? Democratic transitions, all the technical vocabulary that comes with what democracy means, especially from maybe a Western perspective. Not to say that it's not at all applicable in the Middle East. That's a completely other, maybe perhaps debate that we can touch upon at some point. But the demands, عيش حرية عدالة اجتماعية, bread, freedom, social justice. Essentially, these were values in the abstract. And then once it started perhaps take some sort of policies and concrete political transitions in terms of constitutions and elections, etc., all these procedural democracy aspects, I think Egyptians were confronted with a reality that is much more profound, which was it's kind of impossible to do that if you don't have the right institutions, but also political will and backup. And this is why I think we see in our region, I mean, a complete perhaps halt to whatever democratic processes that has started. And maybe there is a distinction absolutely to be made between on democracy, what it means to be institutionalized, and the spirit of what it is. And perhaps it's a bit abstract, but it's not at all, because I feel with time, and perhaps this is what I encountered with my research on intellectuals, these values become instilled over time on a perhaps a more broader level, and on the scale, on the personal level, on personal scale and family unit, and also then collectives, and then on a national level. So these two scales, I'm not expert enough to speak about what constitutional what it means to change constitutions to be more democratic, but I can definitely speak to what a younger generation are doing to perhaps live what it means to be in a democratic space, democratize knowledge production and relationships between people, and that will ultimately, with aggregate, connections, aggregate relationships, will amount to a full democratic transition. But for now, is it enough? It's we hope. I mean, we hope. If it happened, it would be enough. But we're not there yet.
Thank you. Elia?
Yeah. Yeah, reiterating as well, thank you for having me and for this challenging question to start us off. The quick answer, I think, would be no, it's not enough, but there's always lots of caveats to that answer, which is a bit of this boring academic way of answering, I think. But democracy obviously means different things to different societies. In any case, it has changed over time. When we talk about democracy, we're usually not referring to the Athenian version of democracy or whatever. The Swiss have something more direct democracy than the French, for example, etc., with pros and cons to both of those. But I'm from Lebanon, and I tend to study Lebanon and Syria especially, and those are two very drastic or two stark examples of what does the day after look like. So in Syria, we have the fall of the Assad regime, obviously after 54 years. And in theory, let's say that next year they decide to have elections, and let's say everything goes well, and you have a perfectly representative electoral democratic system with all of the flaws that this can come with, but no more so than in another country that is considered democratic. Does that affect the national debt? Does that affect the money that was stolen by the very same regime that was overthrown? And without that money, for example, and I'm using a very concrete example, how would public services be funded? Without those, can one have a democracy? And in the same way, usually I think, would argue not. Institutions, public institutions, schools, and whatnot would be more difficult to fund, for example. Would the balance of power in terms of resources, in terms of who owns the land, for example, is that automatically does that automatically change once there is a new system? Usually not. And so what that means is we know, South Africa being, I guess, a notorious example, that you would still have the legacy of something that is accepted to be unfair, like apartheid, by most people today, and yet the legacy of it continues to this day. So the fact that it is unfair didn't stop the fact that you still have this unbalance of power. Like a majority of the land is owned by 7% or something of the population that is white in South Africa. In Lebanon, let's say not as drastic as Syria, but it's also very indicative. We did have a big uprising in 2019, and some have argued that, myself included, is kind of what that was the Arab Spring moment for Lebanon in 2019, not 2011, in our case. And of course, it did not lead to the fall of the regime for various reasons. One is that it happened in October of that year, and 3 months later we had COVID, and that kind of stopped everything, and other reasons as well. But let's say, again, using the other example, let's say it did happen that we overthrew the sectarian system, a transitional government is installed or comes to power, whatever, and then there is a transitional process that then leads us to a quote unquote perfectly secular society, which was absolutely one of the demands. The abolition of political sectarianism in Lebanon was one of the main demands of the uprising in 2019. But what does that affect the money that has been taken and stored in Swiss banks, as has been reported around 2022, for example, quite a sizable percentage of the GDP is stored there in the form of gold, for example, among other things, I'm sure, but this was just one thing I've read. And the answer, of course, is no. Does that affect the national debt, again, that has been accrued for the most part by the oligarchy and the warlords that has, in this ideal scenario, been overthrown? Usually no. And this, of course, affects the day after, because even if individually, and I'll end on this point, even if individually everyone in Lebanon now agrees, okay, we are a democracy, this is clearly better than what we had before. If we don't have enough physical resources to be redistributed to fund public schools and whatnot, then democracy ends up becoming, quote unquote, ends up becoming essentially the plaything of the elites. People who can afford things, people who have access to certain resources, usually public education, public healthcare, and so on and so forth. And this limits things from the get-go in many ways. So you have a local problem, national problem that can be tackled nationally, but for the most part, not that we cannot do anything without also tackling the international problem, but those two are interlinked.
Thank you. I think your answers kind of complete each other in the sense that, like Elia, I mean, you obviously right with like the material conditions do not change because the type of regime we're in has changed, and this has been a limit um, in all of the democratic transition, or in absence of democratic transition. And there is this kind of a satisfaction of, oh, let's change the constitution, hold new elections, and that's it, like back to business, which clearly has not been able to even not only be an answer to the political demands, but even be an answer to the dreams or to the aspirations or to the desires that were expressed through the revolutions. So maybe I'll talking about dreams and desires and all of those. I want to go back to Layla because you've worked on the archives of social movements in the region since, well, independence, which is a tremendous work. And it led to the publication of many, well, publication and other things. But like, for example, the book L'Esprit de la Révolte, which is well, you've edited it and have other co-authors, some of whom I know, some of whom I don't, but like it was kind of I don't know how to put it, but like a catalogue in a certain sense emotional catalog of the Arab revolutions, which I really loved. And there was also this exhibition that was in Dream City. I think it's a Tunisian contemporary art festival happening in the Medina every 2 years, which was called, the exhibition was called Les Cartes de la Dignité. And it had different, well, artworks from different places, but like it mainly dealt with ordinary people doing ordinary politics. And I don't know, I remember cards from people who um, telling like, oh, how they went to see their loved ones in prison and had to feed them, and then how had to go back home, and that became a map. And there's so many brilliant things in that exhibition. And I kind of noticed that both of these works focus on ordinary people and dignity. These two notions like are pillars of the post 2011 Arab world. It was like, I don't know, like dignity being one of the slogans, but also the kind of, I don't want to say the entrance, because ordinary people have entered, but like, well, the first time ordinary people entered politics and kind of won. Um, and so I wanted to know, why are these two notions important and at the center of your work?
Which two notions? Dignity and ordinary people?
Yeah. Sorry, that was a long question.
Well, thank you. Thank you for what you say about my work and our work in the team. I mean, I was not the only one to write L'Esprit Laïvat, and also Harait al-Karama. We did, like, it was like from our field works. Thing is, like, dignity is an obsession for me, because it came to me as something that was very difficult to tackle, but like always there. And also because somehow most of the people who were speaking about these movements and revolutions, I mean, it's not only 2011, it's also many movements that are connected to existential kind of struggles. It's not just that they come from, ordinary people. It's just that they talk about, like, starting from, let's say, not the post-colonial era directly, but it's very clear that starting from the bread riots, or what is called the food riots or bread riots, this topic or this figure of existential revolts is central to the history of the region, and I'm very convinced of that. And in a way or another, dealing with it from the academic point of view was always somehow like history of defeats and failures. They didn't succeed in, like, meeting, for example, like, the change of regime, access to democracy, whatever, or with some kind of transcendent kind of look at what is dignity, which is supposed to be something that, everybody has and remains when everything falls. And then, when you're a victim, you have a dignity. When you're, like this kind of attribution of something that is lacking almost everything, but still, very human or whatever. So I thought that, like, putting this at the center as something that is not a demand, but a claim, something that is actually somehow put at the center of the revolts, makes a difference. And this is how we try to capture it through looking at the archives of the revolution, but also through looking at the localities. So this is the real history of the maps. So this idea that we could grasp this idea of dignity through what we called terrain de vie in French, so terrains or fields of life. So what belongs to someone, what belongs in terms not only of, structural, spatial things, but also in terms of projections and dreams and so on and so forth. And like what happens when this doesn't work, And I think this is where we can grasp this idea of dignity. So it has many iteration every part and like every spaces and chronologies. But for me, it's, and I'm still working on it, sort of like in the process of again trying to capture it. But I wanted to say something about this, also connected to what Elia just said about this idea of social and economic change. I mean, we are in a world where, I mean, you said, I think, Malek, you said like a change of regime can't bring this. Of course it can. I mean, like this is like this idea of like, you know, bringing these questions of equality, redistribution, whatever, to this, I mean, to the discussion, but also to the real change of regime is not something that is, and it has become something almost impossible because of the structural, globalized, neoliberal, you know, order of the world. So we tend to think that like this is very narrow and has, you know, and this is also another answer to the first question, which is like this, the real democracy is also a democracy that is supposed to change this thing, because as you said, yeah, there's no democracy without justice or equality or whatever. So I think this is the center of what I call dignity, but I think like mainly people call dignity when, and it's also, sorry, I can be very long on that, but what I think is also important to think of is that like this demand for dignity or claim of dignity came in the context of the post-colonial, because you don't claim dignity when you are colonized. I mean, it just doesn't fit. It's something that relates to the end of the promises of emancipation. It's because these promises did not meet their actual like realization. And at some point, I think they were in the process of, I mean, this is why I think I start my own history of this thing in the 70s, 80s. It's because it's the period where you have this whole infiter and whatever adequation to the neoliberal order, and the end of redistribution, and the end of the promises of, you know, education for all, whatever was also behind the dream of emancipation, of the post-colonial emancipation. Sorry, I stop here.
Thank you. It kind of reminded me of a book, a quotation in a book I've read recently, Algérie, Une histoire 1962, popular history. And at some point, there is this mention of Algeria was a country that, I don't remember the English word, of course, but like conjugated in the future. In 1962, like the country was conjugated in the future because everybody had hopes and dreams and expectations. And then, well, in the 70s and 80s, of course, it was, well, not gone, but like disappointed, let's say. But you're right to
betrayed also. I mean,
you're right to correct this idea. I think this is the I mean, I don't believe I don't believe that democracy is what we're not like democracy cannot bring these social economic changes and equality and all that. But this is the thing, it has been narrowed into this technocratic you know, like a small you change a constitution, you hold elections, and we're done. What else do you want? Let's go back to the Washington consensus or whatever. So, wait, where's my question? Ale, so I wanted, like, we had a small call earlier to also catch up, and we talked a bit about your work on new spaces for intellectual work in the region. So during your PhD, you did some field work to understand what were the new spaces for intellectual work. And so could you tell us a bit more about them and their potential and what makes them different from other like more classic spaces?
Yeah, absolutely. It was when I started doing this research, I originally wanted to work on intellectuals during the revolution and just right after in the Egyptian context. And then I sort of look around and ask myself, where are they? Where are these intellectuals? But it was a desert, right? But at some point I realized this is exactly what it was. I was looking for a figure of the intellectual fashioned à la Sartre and like his French, you know, the French counterpart, except that was no longer relevant. It was this figure was quite obsolete, actually, made obsolete by the uprisings. And then I realized there's so much knowledge production made by a new generation, younger agents in very many spaces. And all of them were happening in the realm of culture, right? They weren't culturalist critiques or culturalist explanations of al-azma, the crisis. However, they were these critiques were done through a cultural space. And I found 3 instances that were really interesting. One of them were the parallel education initiatives, who were doing sort of like a 1-year program for young graduates, or really was open to everyone, to study social sciences, which is something that is not really offered in public universities. It's only in private universities, liberal arts colleges. But some YouTube channels, for example, that were vulgarizing sociological theories and political theories, etc. The second one was satire shows. Satire has always been sort of this space, very critical space. And the third one were novels. So we've always been there, but I guess I looked a bit at how that vocabulary of novelists changed. And what I noticed is that there's there wasn't one star intellectual who was sort of like writing newspapers and publishing articles, etc., or monographs. It was collectives, and these collectives would like come to fruition whenever we needed those sort of these ideas. And that intellectual scene felt like it sprung out of need as opposed to profession. And so I realized that the idea of asking what is the role of the intellectual was perhaps the wrong question, because it forced us to think in terms of sort of savior who wanted to tell us what to do, as opposed to whatever was happening on the ground, and then the right people sort of reflecting upon that. And I sort of identified 3 mechanisms, like how they do this, and 3 different social roles, or why they do this in their societies. And I guess the most interesting one I found was this idea of public pedagogy, where, and exactly what we were talking about, sort of democracy, and we all I think all 4 of us had understood democracy differently, and so our answers were sort of catered to that. And I guess this is one of my favorite philosophers, Wittgenstein, who talks about this, how, you know, meaning is use, and so our meaning, our understanding of a concept become how we use it, and so and the idea of and then these intellectuals were sort of providing their audiences not with solutions, not with prescriptions, like the prophetic intellectuals of the Nahda, for example, but rather methodologies. So giving them ways to think about the world, as opposed to content, like how or what to think. And another example of these intellectual circles was with satire shows, and they were engaged in something in sort of this concept of self-criticism. Now, I've been really haunted by Sadiq al-Azm, like book Self-Criticism After the Defeat, and I was trying to make sense of it for a very, very long time. It really stuck with me. But it's no longer useful, but the idea of self-criticism still remains. Like, the way he did it maybe is no longer useful, but the way the value of self-criticism remains. And I thought that the way these new intellectuals did it was very interesting. The novelists, for example, had a mix of scandal, like as theorized by Tariq al-Aris, who's also brilliant scholar, fiction of scandal. And so the idea of fudiha, like, look at what they're doing, this is happening, and the other component is confession. And then comes the idea of autofiction, or relaying writing memoirs as a site for political contestation, just because it's quite intimate. And then this confession in Arabic, i'tiraf, can mean 2 things, right? Can mean it's confessing a sin, but also recognizing an other, right? يعترف بالشخص الذي أمامه. And I thought this double dynamic was brilliant, and I think a lot of people, the people I interviewed, were very aware of this, in the sense that I can only see something I can only recognize a value in the person in front of me if I have it as well. And that sort of back and forth was very interesting. And when it comes to democracy, then I guess on a very, very small scale, this concept is scalable, right? If there's an interaction between two people and you have this idea of constructive i'tiraf, then on a big scale, then you can recognize minorities, you can recognize rights of citizens, etc. But I can go for a very long time on this, but yeah, thank you.
Thank you. It's really interesting, and I look very much forward to read your thesis. So Elia, so I've been, to be honest, I've been listening to your podcast for years now, and it raises a lot of crucial questions. And among those, probably the one that I have, I don't know, the one that really stayed with me was this idea of that we need a left that is people centric and not state centric. And this is especially the case when we think of Syria, because a lot of, well, lefts around the world, but also Arab lefts, have kind of given up on Syria, the Syrian revolution, well, because it didn't look good enough to them, or I don't know. And so they ended up backing the regime, or like at least, well, that's when they were rude, and if they were polite, they would just stay silent, basically. And so I wanted to ask you now, especially now that Syria, well, is no longer like well, is no there is no more Lil Abad, there is no more Assad. What do you make of this necessity of being people centric? Where does where does it need to take us, and why do Arab left need to be more people centric rather than state centric or geopolitics centric?
Mm. Yeah, thanks for that. Very small question. Um, the so again, for me, there will be the quick answer and there may be a bit longer one. The quick answer is that it doesn't work to be state-centric or geopolitics-centric. It tends to come with many more problems than it wants to resolve, let's say. Because by necessity, you have to erase a lot of things if your analysis starts and ends with the state. It has to erase class dynamics. It has to erase regional and regional dynamics as well, and inequities and so on, because it's all about the nation. And as long as the nation is doing well, and of course, who gets to define what that means, then the rest is either not important or could be dealt with later. So sure, we don't have women's rights, but look, we're winning against Israel or winning against Iran or whatever. And that comes with a lot more problems, as I said, than solutions. And in fact, I would argue overwhelmingly so that it's not actually worth engaging on that with that framework. It doesn't mean that you ignore the existence of states. You don't have a choice. They exist. They're there. It's more like what do you prioritize and which voices, which people you uplift, you center in your own analysis of things. So a analysis of Lebanon, and then I'll get to Syria. Analysis of Lebanon looks very, very different if you center the kafala system in Lebanon. The one, for those who don't know, the quote-unquote sponsorship system that racialized women from mostly Ethiopia, Sri Lanka, and the Philippines and other places in Africa, countries in Africa and Asia for the most part, live under this quote-unquote sponsorship system in Lebanon as migrant domestic workers. And they have with very few rights. Their passports are taken, their salaries are really bad, sometimes not paid at all, and so on and so forth. And if you take that as your center, then what is Lebanon? Does it even matter that it is a sectarian system? To some extent, but not really, because ultimately it depends like who the madame, quote unquote, who the monsieur, or the Lebanese owner of the house or whatever, what they do to you. It doesn't matter which sect they're from. Not as much anyway, for the most part. And so that's a choice to center that over what we usually do, which is we tell a story of Lebanon as, well, you have these different sects and they don't like one another and they find a compromise because of X, Y, and Z. That's part of the picture, but why are they all men? Is it a detail in the story? If it is every single one of them, and how can we not include that as the main point of analysis as well? And so you then add and add and add and add different layers to this analysis in many ways. And then, okay, so it's no longer just sectarianism. Sectarianism doesn't exist without patriarchy. Sectarianism doesn't exist without capitalism, and et cetera, et cetera. And all of these other isms that we can add to it, racism, as I mentioned with the kafala system as well. So that would be one reason as to why we should center people in that sense than having the state-based or geopolitical based analysis, because I think it just does a better job. I think it is more accurate. It encompasses more things, more factors, more variables, I guess, than just the state. Like the state is doing good because the leader seems happy. Bastardizing it a bit, but that's kind of how it is usually. And it hides much more than it reveals effectively. The Syria question for me has been the most fascinating one and troubling and this at times despairing as well in the past, well, decade and a half at this point, because Syrians, for the most part, at the very least, those who were in the various areas that were still liberated until they were not, hadn't given up on the revolution. They were adapting to their situations because they have to. But they were still acting in local councils in the early days, of course, the local coordination committees. They were still doing the revolution, if I want to use the verb in that sense, on a daily basis. Not necessarily because they understood something that the rest of the world did not. Maybe there's an element of this because they had to, but because they had to, because this was their day-to-day existence. The state actually did withdraw from various parts of Syria, what Assad himself referred to as the not useful Syria, effectively. And so they had to adapt to that situation. So they formed local councils and had basically a municipal-oriented democracy, municipalism type of democracy. And that did pretty decently, given the circumstances, for quite some time. In Daraya, you even had the militia, which was the branch of the FSA, the Free Syrian Army at the time, when this meant something in the 10 years ago, that was under the control of the civilian council. And so, as far as I know, this was the only example in the entirety of the Arab world where you can really say, with maybe Tunisia as the other exception, that like there is actually a separation of power functionally. Sure, in a small area, but they had to be small out of necessity as well. Syria, I think, became for me almost a litmus test for a lot of the left. As for sorry, my video went out. As for like I will have this thing like, okay, what's this person's politics on Palestine? And I'll have like a box ticked in my head. But also, what's this person's politics on Syria? And then they have to tick two boxes at the same time, and with almost no fail. If they tick one but not the other, then there's a very easy. For me, it's easy to categorize them effectively. Okay, you're pro-Palestine. I'm simplifying here, but you're pro-Palestine because of quote unquote anti-imperialism or whatever it might be, which is valid. But then you don't understand Syria because you're viewing Syria through a Palestine lens, not through a Syria lens. Even doing so, I would argue, you're doing so very badly if it is through a Palestine lens. But that is the intention. And I think there's been fundamentally a failure of internationalism, of understanding that a cause, supposedly leftism, supposedly is inherently internationalist, even transnationalist. It's supposed to go beyond the nation state anyway, in its kind of conception. But that hasn't been the case for a long time because I think of the advent of nationalism, pan-Arabism, and the kind of the after effects of that since the 60s, 70s, which in many ways we're still in the after effects of all of this. So yeah, I'm happy to get more into this as well if you guys want.
Thank you. I'm just going to remind the people on the Zoom that if they want to ask questions, we'll be taking them in a short moment. I think I'm already like at my last question, which is Well, I had again a very very broad question, but I think and that I didn't even write correctly, but I think for like my question would be right now I mean we are witnessing a global fascist wave that has not like there's this way of separating, oh, there's the region dynamics on the one hand and then the West dynamics on the other hand, and but this separation is most of the time extremely wrong, because at the end of the day, like, regimes inspire each other and they look at each other and they imitate each other, and waves are, they don't stop at regional borders or whatever. So we're facing a global fascist wave. And I was wondering, what does it mean today to be, well, I wanted to ask, to be an Arab Democrat, but I don't really know what that means anymore. If it's even a thing, or if it's even the right category to put these things in or to think, but like, what does it mean to be on the side of emancipation today in the face of everything we are facing, which is, well, both, you know, dictatorship, authoritarianism growing in Western countries, anti-immigration, genocide, obviously. But from where we are, let's say, as you're all academics or doctors, or you're all citizens of Arab countries, from where you are, what does emancipation look to you today in these circumstances, and what way forward do you see? And I'm really sorry for how broad this question is, but just inhabit it as you wish.
That's the worst question. I mean, no. How can I answer this question? There is a big wave of fascism, that's true. We're not immune. In Tunisia, we have like lots of proofs that this is there. But it's not something that is completely separated from what came before. So I think we have, my opinion is that we should be careful not to separate something that is the desire for emancipation, the revolt of the people, etc., from fascism. And then in a way that, like, our work, I conceive my work as some kind of description, like, you know, trying to gather as much as descriptive kind of work to be able to, you know, mirror something that is happening in societies, or has been happening historically in societies. And from this description, even though myself, I'm like doing all what I can to bring it to some kind of democratic, emancipatory project, but this same material could bring other kind of political framework. You know, that different answers to the same questions. So in a way, the fact that these democratic transitions happened to come with this very formal and procedural kind of vision and envisioning of democracy is adding to the frustrations and to our frustrations. I'm not talking about like anybody else, in a way that also it can be used, as we saw, of course, in Tunisia very eloquently, you know, like the use of the revolution as a weapon to organize fascism, you know, was so easy to do because everybody was so fed up with what was happening also in terms of oligarchy, but what like India and Anna have been also describing this very well. So this is, for me, the lesson of today. I mean, to be very, very careful to listen and to describe and to still, you know, focus on the possibilities or the potentialities of emancipation. Also because I think politics is really about dynamics. It's not like something that is there. Even fascism is there, but it's still, you know, there's still something processing inside this whole whatever violent, well, I mean, like, that comes with the possibility of whatever emancipation is somehow an old world. We should find something else also in terms of, I think, because it has this very modernist kind of individual perception of what a new project, or you know, could bring. So I think we are in a time where we need to actually really shape, I don't know, what is called the left. This term also I don't use anymore, you know, because of all what was said, because of these like very, very hard. We have to go back to what we experienced actually in these decades, also in terms of ruptures and, you know, what happened with this anti-imperialist frame, what happened, you know, and also what is decolonial, what you know, there is a lot to do, and also, you know, the intellectuals you were talking about pedagogy and also tiraf, recognition, and so on. This is a long process, and I think it has to be said that it's not something that will happen in a day, and like it's something that has to be, you know, curated, nurtured, you know, and you know, and passed on through different ways, and I don't think we can do it anyhow, you know. We need time. we need we need time for this work. It's a deep work that has to be done. This is the only point I really want to insist on. It's just not something that you can just solve like this. Like campaigning for anything that is happening now is very important, but also in the same time trying to keep on with a long-term kind of work without being, you know, because also fascists, it's the way they act now. They actually want us to be, you know, taking into the lights of the of their own crazy politics. So it's also, I think, a very, very important work for us to keep on, you know, finding out our own temporalities and, you know, still dig into what we have to dig into.
Thank you. That was a that was a nice answer to a very confused question. Ala, Lulu.
Yeah. Well, thank you for Malik for this question that will haunt me now. I will have nightmares of this. I guess maybe a better question is, how can we have group therapy on national scale? I think that how can we fund that? But I guess the part of your question that you disregarded when you said the Arab Democrat, and I don't even know what that means anymore. But I think that's exactly the crux of the question. I feel precisely this it is precisely this confusion about the term that is perhaps making us all sort of anxious in trying to answer it, because when I think of these two terms put together, right, it's often what it should be. Well, democracy as an answer to all of our ills should be a political diagnosis, right? There's an issue, a political issue here, and we need to fix it in political terms or in institutions, constitutions, political participation, etc. But what happens is that it becomes a cultural diagnosis at some point. And endless conversations about is democracy compatible with Islam, is asala, hadatha, all of these like words that debates that are perhaps very outdated now. And then we have in Egypt, people will always say like, "A'udhu billah astaghfirullah democratic," something that is completely sort of non-native to this land. And then it becomes a cultural diagnosis as opposed to a political one. And then it takes away, it empties it from its meaning completely. And then democracy at this point becomes sort of an empty signifier, right? People can just fill it with whatever we want. And then it becomes a form of an aesthetic, right? A form of performance, a discursive trick, a party trick. I am a leftist liberal democracy, democratic. And then you're deemed cooler. Well, anyway. But then I wonder. But then the debate is completely misplaced. I find. But I guess I think, and then when you said horizons of emancipation, that's perhaps better, because the word emancipation is vague enough to hold these debates well, and then, or comfortably. And then the first thing I thought of, and I'm thinking about this with you out loud, but the first thing I thought of was intersectionality, right? You have a lot of identities in our region, and each one of us holds different parts of it in one person, in one collective, or on a national scale. But how can we acknowledge all of these different parts that are perhaps competing and hold it on a collective level? And then there perhaps is a better way of understanding what it means to democracy as people-centered, as maybe Elia was saying, like the rights of minorities, especially perhaps in a country like Lebanon. And then we can have productive conversations about definitions, about what it means to about how to fill this term perhaps a bit more meaningfully. And then there's something that I read recently, and I really love this methodology because I'm such a methodology nerd, but Richard Rorty was talking about extending final vocabularies. And I found this very, very interesting. And it means basically each one of us has reached a camp where our identity is formed, what we think of the world or how it should be is formed. And that's we have our base camp, and that's our final vocabularies. But the point of not being, and this is where dogmatism happened, and ideological fervor and sort of fascism, etc., takes place. And his idea was to take a step back and always look at things with irony in the sense of like distance, right? Not really identifying with this. And then he says the way to do this is using old terms to mean new things, or new terms to talk about old concepts. And so if we take democracy an example, exactly as an Athenian version of democracy is no longer applicable now, right? And we know this. And so we use the same word, but we imbued it with different meanings. Now, we haven't really done this productively in our region, but we can also use another word that is more meaningful to talk about what we want, the spirit of democracy. And then maybe you said emancipation. And I think this is an excellent example of what it means to think productively about this. Now, I obviously don't have an answer for the future of our region, but I do think that what is happening on the level of knowledge production, and not only because it's my research, but I do believe that how citizens of our region are finally thinking about their position in the world, not only locally, but also internationally, in very new ways and in very emancipatory ways, in the sense that they don't think they're victims of course, I mean, of course, in a way, but they don't think they're victim of global orders, right? They think, in that sense, they're very sort of post-colonial, if you want to talk about the vocabularies they use, etc. They no longer think perhaps the white man. It's not necessarily something that just because they're able to speak on the same level. And so that post-colonial anxiety is being treated while they produce knowledge about themselves, while they're representing themselves, as opposed to being represented. And I guess on a global scale, this is one way where this younger generation is perhaps looking fascism, this rising fascism in the face, and maybe not taking it on or taking its vocabulary on. Hopefully that helps. It's yeah, fragmented ideas.
Well, I have to say I love the way you inhabited the question.
It was fantastic.
Thank you. Elia, do you want to have the last word? I mean, not the last word, technically. There are still questions from the audience, but this last word.
I can, yeah, so I basically agree with what was already said. I can just add maybe a couple of things. One, we should be wary of framings that are usually associated with natural events and then we use those to apply to humans. So when we talk about a wave, for example, a wave is inevitable, literally, when you have a wave of a, um, sorry about that. Um, let me remove this. So a wave usually like at the sea, it's inevitable. It's like there's a tsunami coming, you cannot do anything about it. Um, that's not how humans work. That's not human societies. There is definitely a rise of something that we can identify as fascism, but there are lots of fractures within it. And it's happening at different scales, on different levels, in different places, not even at the same time. For example, in Syria, you can easily argue that they actually just got rid of fascism. It doesn't mean that what comes after is immediately perfect or amazing or whatever, but it is important to kind of hold these different temporalities essentially at the same time. Um, not every place around the world is currently experiencing what the world is like if you live under Trump. Now, the fact that it is America means that there is a disproportionate impact because it is the United States. But there are different like far rights in Europe, for example, that are not big fans of one another. It doesn't mean that they won't find some ways to collaborate. That is possible, but they may not. And what I'm saying is that there are these fractures within them that we can exploit effectively because there is part of fascism is this projected um, sense, this projection of self-confidence, of invincibility, of like, I decide, I do this, and I'm king or whatever. Um, but the thing about people who say that they're kings is that they're still people. They are still fallible, and they are very prone to mistakes and prone to shortcomings and prone sort of that I think people who are not on that side of things can definitely use to our advantage. Um, so inhabiting different temporalities is something that's very important. It's very difficult to do. I'm not saying like I've mastered it or whatever. And I'm not proposing a individualist solution either, like, or you just overcome it on your own or whatever. It's actually much easier done through, communities than through your own, as like personal project or whatever. But it is very important to do. It's very important to keep in mind that like if the thing that you're currently focused on looks very, very gloomy, it's not to dismiss it. It doesn't mean that there aren't concrete risks associated with what's currently happening and that needs to be tackled head on. But it's important not to take their own projection of the world and integrate it basically, because ultimately that's what they want. They are very confident, at the very least, in how they project things. They don't spend their time discussing the nuances or is this really hypocritical? They don't spend any of this. They can have, I'll end on this quick example. Uh, After the inauguration of Trump, for example, there was a Christian bishop, I believe she was, who condemned him and said like what you're doing is unchristian. And supposedly has to be a big deal for the Christian far right. But they just ignored her. They just ignored it because that didn't suit their purposes. And ultimately, they are political actors before being whatever idealist they may think of themselves or whatever. Um, so that's just important to keep in mind. And right now, in different ways, and we've heard even, and Dr. Layla and Dr. Ala mentioned those as well. People are doing things in their own ways that might seem small, might seem quote unquote irrelevant, might seem like self-contained because they're not taking to the streets. But taking to the streets is one way among so many. And happy to get more into those maybe in the Q&A or something. But I wanted to end on that note that it's a rise of something. I wouldn't describe it as a wave necessarily. I'm just being pedantic here, to be honest. But it's a rise of something, and that rise has a momentum to it. That momentum can be affected. That momentum can be slowed down, can be stopped. Something can happen to one of them. They are like us in many ways. They just have a lot of power, and they have really bad ideas about what the world should be.
Thank you. Well, so now I'll open the floor to audience questions. So we already have one, which I'll read. And I don't know who will answer it, but it's Anthony Zahar asking, is there a model in recent history where a nation or a people went from autocracy to a flourishing functional democracy? Something that might serve as a roadmap or a reference for our nation's endeavor. Well, that's a big question. I don't know who wants to try its luck with it.
I can do. I mean, first, a question, is there a flourishing democracy somewhere? I mean, like, you always have to nurture democracy, but I think like most of what have been done on like transitions, what we call transitions, but not in the sense of this technocratic kind of transition, democratic transition. But in the case, for example, of Spain or Portugal or Greece, I mean, maybe Spain is the most interesting example because it was not a revolution. I mean, there was the passage to democracy. What I think is really interesting in the recent works that like focus on this like end of the Franco regime is that like democracy was actually also brought by people who were not thinking about democracy. Like in very, like as you said, Elia, on very, very, very modest kind of scenes like, you know, like urban spaces, social problems. I mean, like this was not like, was very much linked, for example, to the church. The church, the big church was linked to the regime of Franco, but then like more and more, like more, you know, on the ground kind of church people took the side of the people. I mean, like these construction and the way, and this is why I think we should nurture these small things, because this is the basis of what could last as a democratic base or even hope. So there are not such thing as, you know, models. I think like this is not happening really, but like there are different ways of thinking of this path to democracy. You know, another one was mentioned also by Nia, but like it's like the autonomy of specific experiences in places. I mean, like we can think of Syria, but we can think in South America, many other places where you had like this autonomous places where all the forms of democracy could be experienced, even inside a whole, you know, autocratic or fascist regime. I mean, so these paths are also a way to think in another way of thinking about models. I mean, maybe more like thinking about experiences than models, I would say, but it's not.
Yeah, thank you. It's a very good last remark. So you have to leave.
Yeah, I'm sorry for that.
It's all right.
It's so good to speak with you, and I hope we'll have other occasions. I'll leave you there. Thank you.
Thank you, Laila. It was really
Bye,
nice.
Leila. Thank you very much. Yeah, it was
Thanks,
great.
Leila.
So yeah, somebody added also that Chile and Uruguay are good examples. So since we don't have any more questions, I think, so maybe if you're okay with it, like maybe Elia, you could tell us a little bit more about the From the Periphery project, because I think it's very well worth a small presentation.
Sure, thanks, Malik. I can add. I wanted to add actually very quickly to the question itself because, yeah, the Chile and Uruguay would have been what I would come to mind, or maybe the post-Soviet states, some of them better than others and whatnot. But more importantly, when we um, when we say flourishing democracy, do we mean like forever, or do we mean like it was really good for 5 years and then not? And if that's the case, do we ignore that? Does that not count? You know, there's a lot of we imply a lot of things in that question, which is it's an important one. And when I think of Syria, I don't think of Syria as a nation, as a state, because it by almost by definition with the civil war, it was fractured in multiple different localities. And you would have examples like the one I mentioned of Daraya, where they would have this basically democratic experiment that even after they were exiled, they continued doing it just online. And now that they're back in Daraya, they're continuing it back in Daraya. Like almost like the period of exile was almost like a temporary blip, effectively, in their work. They started during the revolution, then during the siege of the Raya by the Assad regime, and then they continued in exile, and now they're continuing, well, in the Raya itself. And so that's an example of how they did not take their physical exile as being the end of the story, effectively. From the periphery, yeah, it's a media collective. It's about a year old now only, but it comes out of different, mostly podcasts and a zine, Antidote zine, that does transcripts of various outlets. And we were sort of these different podcasts, different media, basically, were doing different things, but very much in conversation with one another. Often someone would come on like my podcast, I would go on theirs, or we'd have some interactions of some kind. And it was almost an organic thing we all decided together that let's make this into a media collective, which we call From the Periphery. The purpose is really to connect different media projects and even help create new media projects that are based in what we call peripheral politics, which is a bit what I try to explain in I think the first answer, something like what do you choose to center, a perspective or an experience, a lived experience, a positionality, whatever you might say, that is usually marginalized. And what does the world look like when you do that, when you kind of flip the center on its head effectively? And yeah, we're expanding or as much as we can, of course, and we have little resources and small budget, but we're doing our best. And the idea is that we want to connect different parts of the world doing their own autonomous projects effectively, but in conversation with one another. So we're mostly Middle East and North Africa and the Caucasus right now. But within our collective, we have a couple of us who are already focused on Latin America, another couple who are already focused on, well, one who's focused on Asia, East Asia specifically, and we'll get more people, added to the team as we hopefully grow with time. But that is basically the goal for now.
Well, it's a very interesting project that I've tried to follow here and there from different like doors, basically. So I think we don't have any more questions from the audience. So I think we can close it here. I mean, Alef, you want to add something or like?
No, it's been wonderful and wonderful to hear about the from the periphery as well. I really like the idea of flipping it on the center on its head, and the fact that there's a collective work. It really is the future to do sort of these endeavors in groups, right, as opposed to sort of a lonely intellectual production work. Yeah, no, it's all we can see. Thank you, Malek, very much for moderating.
I'm officially not like I'm supposed to stop now to answer the needs of the cat. Whatever it is. So thank you very much. I loved having you, and I really loved our conversation. All right. So again, sorry for the very difficult questions. But it was really a pleasure to have you all with us, and I hope we'll meet soon. And I want to also thank he's caressing the microphone. I want to also thank the audience for listening in. Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Malek,
Thank you.
Elia.